year for you. And then he stayed there actually and did a master's degree with Mark Denny, looking at the impacts of oyster catchers on limpet, behavior and adhesion properties and other things, community ecology of limpets. And then he went to University of Washington to do a PhD with John Wingfield, and John's lab was doing a lot of work on kind of seasonality in things like white-crowned sparrows, and Tom arrived there and became fascinated with this bird that he's going to tell you a lot about today, the red crossbill, because it seemed to kind of buck a lot of normal trends in kind of scheduling and physiology. And his work and a lot of the work that has been built off of that PhD has kind of uncovered some misunderstandings, and I think also offers some really interesting kind of general questions about how animals schedule things in their lives, because scheduling turns out to be quite important to fitness. So after his PhD, he was a postdoc at Johns Hopkins University with Greg Ball, where he did some neuroendocrinology. And then he got his first job at Princeton University. He was there for a few years before he decided to move out of the lovely state of New Jersey and move to Alaska for a year at University of Alaska Fairbanks, and then finally ended up at UC Davis, where he's been for the bulk of his career. That's where I had the pleasure of joining his lab. It's where he's earned some mentorship awards for his incredible lifelong commitment to mentorship, and has published a gazillion papers on all kinds of things, really, but especially what he's going to tell you about today. So welcome, Tom. Oh, also, just real quick, afterwards, we are going to go to Downward Dog. So if anybody would like to join us, you are more than welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie, for that amazingly generous introduction. Let me hang on just a second. There's that. Let me see if I can get this thing put in here. Is that working or is that not still working? Good. Okay. And I've got a million ways to do stuff here, and it's probably going to baffle me and I'll get all confused. So should provide some good entertainment. So I'm really pleased to be here. I have been looking forward to coming up to Corvallis for a while. I was in the High Sierra a bunch of the summer, which is, of course, a good place to be too. But I love the Northwest, and so I'm looking forward to being here. I'm liking the rain that we're starting to get, and would love to interact with any and all of you who would like to chat about anything. What I'm going to talk about today, it's actually pretty basic, what I want to get across, but it's some sort of, I think, fairly fundamental things about scheduling of birds in particular, but animals in general. And here's a basic outline for the talk. I'm going to talk about, let me see, is this going to work? I think I might use this just because then the people who are on, can you see that? Yeah. People who are watching this from who knows where will also be able to see whatever I'm pointing at. So I'm going to start out just by talking a little bit about annual scheduling, because I think it's a really key problem, as Jamie said, in the field of integrative organismal biology. A huge amount of animals' fitness is determined by how well they schedule events in their lives. And then I'm going to talk about crossbills as a model of a kind of in a weird extreme case. That was why I got interested in them. Spoiler alert is that I don't think they're as weird or extreme as we've thought for a long time. And we'll come back around to that and talk a little bit about the implications of what it would mean for how we understand scheduling of life events, if crossbills really are that weird and that extreme. But then we'll talk about what I think they're actually doing and present some data there. And then once we finish with that, we'll talk a little bit about, given that maybe they're not quite as weird and extreme as we thought, and what does that mean for mechanisms for birds and other kinds of animals to schedule things on an annual schedule. And then we'll finish off by just talking about where some of these myths about them came from, because turns out there's just a lot of kind of nonsense that's been written about them. And it sounds great, but I think it's just wrong and misleading and makes us think that in order to be as flexible as a crossbill is, and I'll show you a little bit about that, that we have to basically throw out the rule book from other kinds of birds that we know a lot about. And I think, in fact, we don't need to do that. So we'll start with this, annual scheduling. So back in 2008, John Wingfield wrote a paper that summarized a number of other papers that he'd written over the years, where he talks about how birds and other kinds of animals subdivide their lives into a bunch of what he called life history stages. I sometimes call them life cycle stages. You could call them either thing. This is a Gambel's white-crowned sparrow right here, one of the subspecies of white crowns, long distance migrant. And John subdivided their lives into 6 categories of stages. And if you start with breeding, they breed in the Arctic and at other high latitudes. They follow that with a pre-basic molt, so replace all the feathers on the body. They then move to their fall migration. They come south and spend the winter in the Southwest. There's a few around here, I guess. And then they go through another molt at the end of that period where they replace some of the feathers, refresh the plumage a bit, get ready for spring migration that takes them back to the breeding ground. And then this just goes on over and over repeatedly for as long as the bird lives. So they've got these stages. The stages occur at a particular time of year. Each one occurs at a particular time of year. They occur in a particular sequence. And this timing of these events is absolutely critical to the bird's fitness. And there's actually a couple of timing challenges that they face. One of them is matching those stages to the appropriate conditions in the environment so that they happen at a time when they can be completed successfully, but also so that the fitness benefits from them can be accrued. So it's not beneficial to molt the plumage at a time when you actually don't need new feathers, for example. So they molt the plumage at a time where they're going to most benefit from having fresh feathers for insulation and fresh flight surfaces. So there's particular times of year that it's a good idea to do these things that fitness benefits from each of these stages. So they have to match them up with the environment. Call that synchronization with the environment. But they also have to coordinate these stages with one another. They've got all these stages that have to happen in a particular sequence and not conflict with one another. So they need to do both of these things, match with the environment and coordinate the stages with one another to produce an adaptive entire schedule. The way they do this is to use environmental cues. They're responsive to a variety of environmental cues, and there's a huge literature on how day length affects a lot of kinds of birds. Most temperate zone birds are what we call long day breeders, and they respond to the increasing day length in the spring to bring themselves into breeding condition. But this also kicks off a whole sequence of events, such as preparation for migration, the spring molt, and so forth. And I'll come back to that in just a minute. The day length, the responses to day length essentially set the scaffolding for the entire annual schedule. And if you take a white-crowned sparrow and put it in a cage and expose it to changing day length, you can basically recreate the entire annual schedule in the basic structure of it, where they come in, they do each of, or they try to do each of the things that's in the natural schedule. They might not be able to breed because you might not be able to, they might not have the space or whatever to do that, but they come into breeding condition and they sing and so forth. Reproductive hormones change. They molt on schedule. They can't migrate, but they try to migrate. They become nocturnally restless and so forth. They do all of this stuff. Just changes in day length are enough to produce the basic schedule. Under real conditions, they respond to all these other kinds of cues to like food and weather conditions and ambient temperature, social factors from conspecifics, all of those things serve to fine tune the schedule to whatever the local conditions are. So they use day length as a long-term predictive cue, and then all these other cues as fine-tuning short-term predictive cues. And based on, it's now 100 years of work, William Rowan started the work on avian photoperiodism in 1925. So we're almost at 100 years now since the first experiments were done. There's been a pretty detailed kind of rule book or toolkit or whatever you want to call it that has developed for our understanding of how birds time these annual schedules. And there's 3 basic phases that they go through, a bird like a white-crowned sparrow. So if you start in the winter, the overwintering period, they're what I would call responsive. They're said to be photoresponsive, but they're also potentially responsive to other kinds of cues. Their brain, the gonadotropin releasing hormone system in the hypothalamic region, is ready to respond. They've made a lot of it, and it's sitting there ready to be released, but the cues are not stimulatory, so it's not being released. So the pituitary is inactive, at least in terms of production and release of gonadotropins, LH and FSH, and the gonads are small. That's what this is supposed to show here. This is a little gonad as compared to over here. So then the days get longer, and they start to respond. He comes up above some threshold, and the white-crowned sparrow now perceives this as a stimulatory photoperiod. And these environmental cues, especially long-term predictive, but then the supplementary cues that we mentioned before also kicking in. And this brings the bird into a state of being stimulated. So GnRH gets released. And there's a lot of details known now about the process by which they measure photoperiod and decide whether it's a long or a short day, and what exactly at the neuroendocrine level leads to changes in secretion of GnRH. So then GnRH stimulates the pituitary to produce and release the gonadotropins, and then the gonad responds to those and grows and produces steroids, and those steroids affect a number of things, singing behavior, for example, courtship behavior, those sorts of things. So they make this transition into this stimulated state. All right, so the brain is active in this hypothalamic pituitary gonad axis in both cases, but in the first case, it's not doing anything yet. It's just sitting there ready to go. And in this case, it's stimulated and the bird comes into breeding condition. And it'll do that in response to just increasing day length, but other cues are important as well under real conditions. So another thing also happens though, because they then make a transition to this refractory or unresponsive state. And this happens to terminate reproduction at an appropriate time. And sometimes it's often happening when conditions in the environment are still really good. You would think, why aren't they continuing to breed? A Gambel's white-crowned sparrow above the Arctic Circle goes through this transition on constant light. Okay, it hasn't even gotten dark yet for 2 months, and the bird ceases to perceive this as a stimulatory cue and becomes what's called refractory. And this refractoriness is a super important part of the annual schedule for these seasonal breeders, because it brings them out of reproduction into the next phase, which is molt in the case of most songbirds, and preps them for migration. And they do this much earlier than you would think they should based on how nice the conditions are at the time. They're doing it because it's adaptive to get finished and get out of there. If you're above the Arctic Circle, you have to leave, or you're going to get caught in winter conditions when you're not ready to leave. So that actually happens spontaneously in a white-crowned sparrow. So if you just photostimulate them, put them in a cage, put them on long days, they'll come into breeding condition, leave them on those long days. You can just put them on, say, 16, 18 hours of light per day, leave them there, and after 6-8 weeks, the gonads spontaneously collapse and they become refractory. So they're programmed by the initial photostimulation for the timely termination of breeding as well. And that turns out to be super important. Then now they're waiting now for some further input from the environment, and they experience what they need, short days, to break that refractory period when they get to the wintering grounds. So short days break the refractory period and put the brain back into the active state of making GnRH again. So they just cycle through these three phases, these three stages. So that's basically what happens. There's a ton known about the responsiveness of a lot of different kinds of birds to all these different types of cues and the mechanisms involved. When I started graduate school, I was super interested in exploring whether there was something fundamentally different about species that were considered weird and extreme. And the crossbill is actually one of those. There was a lot written about Australian desert birds as well at the same time. In fact, here's the kind of things that were in the literature at the time. Crossbills are conifer seed specialists, and their beak is good for that. Even this is an exaggeration. They certainly are adapted to forage on conifer seeds. They use the beak to pry open cones and get at seeds that a lot of times other animals don't have access to. But I'm not going to go into this in any detail right now, but actually this is sort of a myth too, in my opinion, because they spend a bunch of the year eating a lot of insects, and in parts of the year, they depend on insects. And I would say actually the nomadic forms of crossbills could not have evolved without their dependence, without the access they have to insects at crucial times of year. This has just been completely ignored, but this is just a natural history issue that I'm not going to dwell on here. Conifer seed availability is unpredictable in space and time. That is a pretty reasonable statement. Conifers they produce cones in these big bursts, boom bust cycles. Not all of them do this, but a lot of the ones that crossbills do this. So there's unpredictability in space and time of the main food source. As a result, crossbills are nomadic. There's a lot to unpack with calling them nomadic too. We're not going to dwell on that too much today either. And then here was the big thing from my perspective. They breed in all months. This is all over the place in the literature. Whenever they encounter abundant conifer seeds, and they even go so far as to just breed continuously for many months if they find an abundant cone crop. So I'll just show you a few colorful and entertaining kinds of quotations. Here's one from Griscom, 1937. This is just 10 years after Rowan showed that juncos respond to photoperiod. So people were all a dither about that wonderful thing. Those who fondly believe that the riddle of migration has largely been explained by the effects of increased exposure to light and heat on the secretion of the sex hormones will find the crossbill a tough nut to crack. So that, of course, caught my attention. There's some other, and the reason he said that is because they were known already by then to breed even in January in, for example, the Rocky Mountains. Here's a couple other quotations. The red crossbill probably has the most erratic breeding schedule of any North American bird. At various localities in its range, it has been found over a period of time breeding in every month of the year. And another quotation, this is from Nethersole Thompson's book, Pine Crossbills, which is about crossbills in Scotland. In parts of their range, common crossbills, which is what the Europeans call red crossbill, breed in every month of the year. Their ability to withstand a cold and severe climate, enabling them to breed whenever there is a good cone crop. And then here was the one probably that really kind of caught my attention the most. We are impressed by the parallel between the situations facing nomadic desert finches of Australia and crossbills. In each case, the birds move in flocks through vast areas of fairly uniform and generally unproductive habitat until their wanderings or the passing of time bring them to an area suitable for breeding. There's a whole bunch of implications there that the birds are basically dealing most of the time with scarcity, and then they need to be ready to just take advantage at the drop of a hat of some unpredictably encountered abundant food resource. So there's a whole bunch of things you might expect to be true of a bird that is like that. So the idea is they wander around through a bunch of habitat, like conifer forest, looking for cones. And then occasionally they find something like this, that there's a big bumper crop of cones, and then they would use it explosively. Okay, well, if this is true, if these things are true, then there's basically, we really need to kind of throw out that rule book. If crossbills are effectively doing what people had reported, we pretty much need to assume that they're not following the rule book that the white-crowned sparrow did. They're not going to be photoperiodic. They're going to respond. So for example, they're going to respond to food, not photoperiod. So that we'd be just switching the emphasis completely. Breed whenever they find abundant food. So there can't be like a refractory period. Breed continuously if food remains abundant. So there wouldn't be any kind of programmed termination of breeding. And furthermore, it was specifically hypothesized back around 1959 that the birds, not crossbills specifically, but all these nomads and stuff in Australia, that they maintain a tonically active reproductive axis. So they don't even necessarily would not be expected to show declines in reproductive condition, the collapse of the gonads that's typical of seasonally breeding birds. And the brain would presumably just stay ready to respond to cues all the time. Well, okay, so that's all sounds great, and I was all excited about studying them because of those possible major differences, because we knew lots already then, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, about the way birds process environmental cues and produce these cycles, but we didn't know much about these really erratic ones. So I started studying them, and thank goodness, actually, my advisor, John Wingfield, encouraged me to do some just basic descriptive stuff. We were talking today at lunch, the grad students and I, about how important it can be. I call it Tinbergen's zeroth question. Tinbergen wrote a paper in 1963 in which he described the 4 questions. He lays out the 4 questions about behavior, the proximate and ultimate questions about behavior that should lead to hypotheses. But that paper, he also emphasizes how important it is to do basic descriptive observational natural history, because the point I'm partly trying to make is the rest of what you do is only as good as the foundational observations that you start with. And as it's turning out, I think the basic observational literature about crossbills is still fraught with people making nonsensical statements about them. So what are they actually doing? Okay, so I started doing field work on crossbills in 1987, so I'll put a date on it. At the time, I just need to give an aside. This was especially for grad students getting started at the time. So some of you may be familiar with Jeff Groth and Craig Bankman's work about all these different types of red crossbills. I'm not going to talk much about all these different types. But at the time, all there was stuff like that Griscom monograph from 1937, where they name a zillion subspecies. Subspecies doesn't even work as a term for crossbills because they're breeding in the same locations all the time. There's no geographic separation of these varieties. And there was just starting to be information about these vocal types of crossbills then. And Jeff Groth in particular, it wasn't until 1988, so after I started studying crossbills, that Jeff published his first paper where he described types 1 and 2 from the Appalachians. These are vocal types that also are ecomorphs. They differed in size and morphology. We now know of 12 ecomorphs with different vocalizations in North America. One of those has been split off. Type 9 has been split off as its own species. Currently, state of upheaval, people arguing about this, as you can imagine. But whatever you want to call them, I think there are probably 12 at least taxa, whatever name we give the taxa. None of this was known when I started. I was just going out and trying to find crossbills. And at first, all I knew is I had found some in the Eastern Cascades. They turned out to be type 4, but I didn't know that at the time. Type 4 is a medium-sized bird. You should have lots of them in Oregon. They're typically associated with Douglas fir. But over the next year, I sort of figured out there were 4 types in Washington. And then I discovered Jeff Groth, and he kind of cleared the fog away, and I could really understand what I had. So there are 4 common types in Washington. For any of you who are cross-bill nuts, it's types 2, 3, 4, and 5 out of 12. In Oregon, you have all of those as well, but you also have a lot of type 10. So those are the ones out on the coast. And that's just very recent discovery, relatively, that there is this thing. We thought they were probably just type 4 before, but they turned out to be distinct. So I know this is all, scintillating here about type this and type that. But part of the point that I'm trying to make here is just at this stage, I didn't even know what in the heck the birds were. They were crossbills, but it turns out I was encountering multiple what could be species. And this was something that was very much unfolding at the time, and you just have to be paying really close attention. I was fortunate to be able to have them in captivity. I was figuring out about the call types myself, but it wasn't until I talked to Jeff Groth, who was at the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology, where he could tell me, okay, your types, my types 1, 2, 3, and 4 were 4 of his types that he had described in detail, and it was really helpful. Well, so then I took my qualifying exam in the spring of 1988 and got back out in the field immediately after that wonderful experience. And there were a ton of these other ones, type 2, big crossbills. They're one of the big forms that had settled to breed in the ponderosa forests on the eastern slope of the Cascades. And I was actually just looking back through my notes about this and realizing how many trips I made where I couldn't even tell where the birds were going to settle. It was just really, really unnerving because I hadn't had much experience with these things yet. So I was just really anxious to find a place where I could find them breeding. And I got fortunate. One of my mentors, Gordon Orion, somebody at the University of Washington, who many of you may have heard of, a pretty famous ecologist, he happened to have been over to a place called Meek's Table, east of Mount Rainier. And I had just come back from one of my field sites where there had been lots of crossbills and there were a lot of cones, and then the crossbills just disappeared. And I got back to Seattle and I was talking to him and he said, I was just over at Meek's Table and there were a ton of crossbills there. And so I went back and sure enough, a place called Devil's Table where I went, there were a bunch, and that's where this photograph was taken. This is a ponderosa pine in probably July or August. It's not a mature cone yet. And the crossbills were settling there in large numbers, these big type 2s, and they're eating the seeds of these trees then. This is a big fist-sized cone. Here's one that the crossbills haven't messed with yet. Here's what they look like after the type 2s finish with them. They eat those things on the tree, and it's an extraordinarily energy-demanding process that they're engaged in there to do that. And in fact, they'll even like wear all the feathers off one side of their face to get down into those cones. It's a major undertaking. They're breeding then. I'm finding them settling to breed. And what I'm going to show you here now is just some very basic data. I was catching them. So I had caught some birds. I had decoys, live decoys that brings the birds down to check out what's going on. And I started misnetting them. And I was doing laparotomy surgeries to look at the gonads because we needed to look for reproductive cycles or whether they didn't have them at all. Did they just match what the prediction was, where they're just going to stay with tonically big gonads all the time, or what? So I was doing those surgeries, and then I could ban the birds and let them go. And I was taking blood to look at reproductive hormones and so forth. And here's what the pattern. Oh, here's the other thing that happened is starting in September, I was also learning about conifers at this time. So starting in September, the cones of ponderosa pine open and start dumping their seeds. And so this picture is actually from a cone more like in November. But right around the early parts of September, the cones are opening up, seeds are falling out. And as it turned out, the crossbills were starting to form flocks already then. And as it turns out, their gonads were collapsing. So here, these data actually are from both that location in 1988 and another location that Jamie's been to. One of our other collaborators, another grad student, Rod Kelsey, had found a bunch in 2002 in the Warner Mountains down in Southern Oregon, just northeast of Lakeview. And these data are a combination from those two times where there was a huge ponderosa crop. And the main point here is the gonads just collapsed in the autumn. These, in a crossbill, if the testes are below about 4 millimeters in length, they're non-spermatogenic. They're not making active spermatozoa. So this was a surprise to me because there was a huge ponderosa crop, but then I was thinking, well, maybe they just responded to the fact that the ponderosa cones opened and dumped their seeds and they stopped breeding. Well, then I went back in the winter. In January, I got back to this field site. It was actually kind of a hair-raising drive through the snow up a really crappy road. I was pretty sure my truck was going to be there until April. But we made it and was laparotomizing crossbills again and observing them, and they're all in breeding condition again. Well, this was one of those few occasions in my life as a biologist where I was just poleaxed. I totally did not expect this. I thought since they had stopped breeding in the fall, they were going to stay non-reproductive for the rest of the year because this, according to the dogma, had to be because the seed supply had declined. But they're eating the same cones. They're feeding on the same cones here as they were back here. And these, if anything, have fewer seeds because there aren't any new seeds made in that interval. They're just losing seeds either to seed predators or to seeds falling out. And furthermore, it's colder and the days are shorter than they were back here. And yet the birds are back in breeding condition. So this was just this was stunning to me. And they then continued breeding through the spring, made a zillion fledglings. There were other reasons to believe they had really stopped breeding in the fall. The females refeathered their incubation patches and didn't develop new ones until the winter. Incubation patch is a thing on the belly that they use as like a hot water bottle to transfer heat to their eggs and babies. And there was very little singing during the autumn. And by the end of December and beginning of January, there were no fledglings in the flocks anymore that you'd expect to have been present if they had continued breeding in the fall. So this was this was the first year I did field work, and I came away from it just kind of scratching my head and thinking, this looks like what a white-crowned sparrow would do. This looks like a refractory bird that terminated reproduction when conditions are great because it became refractory to the stimulatory effects of long days. Well, that's one type and not just one location, but one tree type, one type of crossbill, type 2, and one tree type, ponderosa pine. There's a bunch of different types of crossbills, and there are a bunch of different types of conifers that these different crossbills use. What I'm going to show you next just shows it's a figure that's involved in some work that Jamie and I are still doing to try to dispel some of the myths about crossbills. But if we look at 4 different types, the 4 different types that are common in Washington, there's these 4 types 2, 5, 3, and 4, different colored things here. You can see that in the fall, all of them are collapsing the gonads, and virtually all these data they're not being collected in places that are kind of half-baked, not such great conditions. These are great cone crops, huge cone crops of Western hemlock and Sitka spruce, and the type 3s are collapsing the gonads. Huge cone crops of Douglas fir, and the type 4s are collapsing their gonads. Huge cone crops of ponderosa pine, and the type 2s are collapsing their gonads. Huge cone crops of spruces and Douglas fir, and the type 5s are collapsing their gonads. So they're all doing that. I'm presenting males because we catch more males and we have better data from the males, but the paper that we're working on, and we were just talking about today, trying to finally get the darn thing out, has a bunch of data about females as well. But one of the lessons here for grad students is this is sort of stuff, literally, I started collecting these data in 1988. And there's some of this, it can be hard to get the data. It's not always easy to catch crossbills, especially during the molt. It's hard to get them at this time of year. And so it can just take a while to get enough stuff to persuade yourself that you really know what you've got. And especially when something is flying in the face of what everybody says, you don't want to just be, go out there 1 year, get a little bit of data, and then get this paper out. I don't think, anyway. I think you want to really nail it down. So it looks like they just become refractory in the fall. Well, so why would they do that? Well, it turns out one of the big elephants in the room about everything anybody had written years ago about these things is nobody said a word about molt. And this is one of the things when Jamie came to UC Davis, she started looking at the whole schedule. I had been focusing on reproduction, and she started looking at molt and especially migration. And when you think about the whole cycle, the animal it doesn't have to just schedule breeding right. It has to produce an adaptive schedule. So this is one of the lessons that I think looking at these birds helps us to be reminded of that we shouldn't just be thinking about these individual stages that might be what we're studying. We study reproduction a lot on white-crowned sparrows, but it's really useful to think about the entire schedule and how they produce an adaptive schedule. So here's a guy in Wyoming who's replacing the first few primaries on the hand section of his wing, and then these ones are all old. And the other thing that's really interesting is when they're molting, it's a nice orderly process, just like in a white-crowned sparrow. Jamie's shown that they're actually molting more slowly, maybe, than a lot of the other kinds of songbirds. But it's still a nice orderly process. It's not some willy-nilly haphazard thing that you might expect of some crazy opportunist. When they get into the latter parts of molt, you'll see that where they bring in all of the body plumage. Here's, I was going to say a little male. This is a great big bruiser of a male. Actually, that beak looks like one we want to be careful of when you're handling them. This guy's making this transition from his sort of multicolored yellowish orange plumage that he had before, and he's producing a big ton of nice red, orangish red feathers. So he's going to be really snazzy looking when he finishes that. This is a hugely demanding process, not lots of protein required. It also is associated with a large amount of just energetic expenditure. Molt is expensive energetically, and it also is coincident with being poorly insulated. Because these, for example, this feather, feather's got a bunch of blood coming up into it to provide the resources to make those feather barbules and everything. And so basically the bird's blood is coming out closer to its surface. It's not very well insulated. So if they don't molt in time and it starts to get cold, they're going to be experiencing huge energetic demands. And here's a figure from one of Jamie's papers that shows that the birds are molting in the fall. This is not just 1 year. This is data from a whole bunch of types, a whole bunch of locations, and a whole bunch of years. Crossbills molt in the late summer and early autumn, exactly when they make this transition to being non-reproductive, just like a white-crowned sparrow. So what are the implications of that stuff for how we think about timing in general? Well, first of all, if we think about crossbills specifically, let's talk about crossbills specifically. So here's just a circle diagram showing when different stuff happens. The outer ring is when stuff is happening with cones. Cones are developing in the early summer. They mature by late summer. This varies among tree species a bit in terms of when the cones open, but the maturation schedule is really similar. in a lot of different tree species. Seeds start to fall out of the cones in September and October in most tree species that crossbills use. And then there's some variable period of time of seed availability out into the next spring. So in a really good situation like what the crossbills experienced at Devil's Table in the Ponderosa, there's a lot of seed fall happening here, but there's a bunch of seeds being retained that are enough for these crossbills, which are really efficient at getting seeds out of cones, to actually resume breeding in the fall. I'm sorry, in the winter. Okay, so then you get out to this point, if they've stayed at the same place for that whole time, breeding in the winter and spring, they reach a point where there's no seeds left. And in fact, the cones are falling off the trees and it's time to get out of there and they need to move. And this is something that they have to do in most cases annually. And they might have to move anywhere from a few hundred kilometers to a couple thousand kilometers. And they don't know how far they're going to have to go. And they're going to have to do it by moving through habitat that probably has no seeds. So they're doing this. There's a seasonal nomadic migration. Jamie's shown that they fatten for that. In addition to that, it's clear that they're also relying on insects then. I mentioned this. So those insects are crucial to this bridge, this time from when they leave the last bits of a cone crop and find the next one that could be hundreds of kilometers away. So there's this seasonal nomadic migration followed by summer breeding if they find a good place, which most of them I think usually do. And then partway through that, they start molting and then accelerate into completing the molt. This is just like a white-crowned sparrow. Spring migration, summer breeding, and then molt. It's strikingly like a white-crowned sparrow. It's pushed late. They're breeding pretty late compared to a white-crowned sparrow, but the basic sequence is really similar. And then they sort of cool their heels for a while. And if there's enough to eat, then here's one of the things they do that's really unusual is that they can start breeding again on really short days. So that's something a white-crowned sparrow can't do. And it's interesting to think about what their toolkit is to allow them to do that. But it actually really only requires tweaking the basic ways that white-crowned sparrows and juncos and starlings and all these other seasonal breeders do things. It's just adjusting photoperiodic thresholds a little bit and maybe dialing up sensitivity to some of these other cues at times of the cycle. But the basic cycle where there's these seasonal changes in their responsiveness to various environmental cues is the same, I think. And then basically one of the fundamental things that's really important is just they've got these stages. It wasn't clear to me when I was reading these things originally that they would even have these distinct stages. They might just have one big chimera stage where they're always ready to breed and they're sort of molting slowly and or something. And in fact, zebra finches in some parts of their range probably do that. But even they seem to have elements of these seasonal and stage-specific processes. So how do they coordinate the stages to avoid conflicts? That was one of the two things that I said the birds need to do. First, they follow a sequence, just like other seasonal species. And there's certain things that are anchoring those, the spring migration and the molt in particular. And then they mostly segregate those stages from one another to avoid too much overlap. That's like what a white-crowned sparrow does. And then they use cues to sync up with the environment. They use photoperiod. I didn't show the data on this, but there's clear evidence now that they're responsive to day length. That sets the basic structure of their cycle. They're highly sensitive to non-photic cues to fine-tune timing, but so are lots of other species, song sparrows and other kinds of birds, white crowns that have been studied are very responsive to other kinds of cues as well. They're not equally sensitive to all of these cues at all times of year, and they seem to have this refractory period in the end of the summer that facilitates completion of the molt. So one thing that I think they do that's pretty interesting is that they probably do more parallel processing of cues. So what do I mean by that? So here's a figure that I took out of a paper that we wrote that Heather Watts is the first author on, where we were talking about queue dependencies and the interactions among queues. And I just want to emphasize these two panels right here. So a white-crowned sparrow actually needs to be at least mildly photostimulated before it will respond to other cues. So if queue A is photoperiod and queue B is, let's say, social stimulation or food or something, some other supplementary kind of cue. So a white-crowned sparrow that you expose only to increasing day length will partially grow the gonads, even if the days aren't super long, as long as they're above a threshold. But if you only provide like sexual stimuli from a mate or something, no response happens if it doesn't also get photostimulated. So if it's on short days and you give it a sexy mate that you've made sexy by giving it estradiol or testosterone or something, depending on which sex you're giving, you won't have any effect on the reproductive axis. If you put the two together, then you get full reproductive development. And this is what we call serial processing. And these are two cues that are enhancing one another. So it's serial because one happens and then the other, and then you get the full response. But you can also have parallel processing where effectively one cue can substitute for the other. So either sexy mates or food or the combination of those things, or photoperiod can bring a crossbill into reproductive condition. And we actually know that now. So they're doing that, and they can do that in January. So the days can be short, but if they have sexy mates and lots to eat, they'll come into full reproductive condition. The white-crowned sparrow can't do that, but this is basically, that's a pretty interesting modification, but it sure isn't throwing out the whole rule book that the white-crowns had. It's an interesting difference. So I want to spend just a couple minutes saying where these myths about, some of the stuff, I made it, I think, pretty clear that we have found no evidence that crossbills breed throughout the year or that they breed continuously whenever there's an abundant cone crop. But we still get reviewers who say, oh, well, you just haven't studied them in enough places yet or something. Where did these myths come from? Well, there's one quotation I want to show you here from this is one of my favorite authors, Ian Newton, who wrote a wonderful book called Finches, that was basically my Bible as a graduate student. So here, this is in red. He said, in the European spruce forests, breeding may begin in August, soon after the cones have formed, and continue until the following April or May. That's continue all that whole time when the seeds have fallen. Such prolonged breeding is apparently usual in northern Russia, and he cites Formasov 1960. Ian got it wrong. Formasov was written in French. I never read the paper for a long time because I was just trusting Ian. Lesson to everybody, go to the original sources. So Formasov does not say what Ian says he says. What Formasov said is they breed in July, August, September, and then they start again in December, January, February, March. He says nothing about breeding in October and November. And that may seem like, well, this is sort of trivia. This is a big deal in terms of understanding how these birds do stuff and the implications for, do we have to throw out the white-crowned sparrow rule book in order to understand a crossbill, which has this incredibly flexible reproductive schedule that can go from January to the next October, basically, at least September. They can do it with the basic rule book that white-crowned sparrows are following. There's other examples. So this is one of the things that's been cited over and over again, including by me, as that crossbills are potentially infinitely flexible. And then, I'm scratching my head saying, well, but none of the ones we study haven't been. Here's another one. There's just a statement in a paper. This is another great paper in a lot of ways, but they say this observation of a nest found in July 1953 completed the record for crossbills nesting in every month of the year in Colorado. They don't show any evidence of it. They just say that. And I, for a long time, just thought, well, there must be something they knew that they just didn't include in the paper. But in fact, they show no evidence of August, September, October, or November It's a little suspicious when August is like the hot spot time of year for crossbills in the Ponderosa Forest in Colorado. Somebody wasn't paying attention there. But this is another example. There's a whole bunch of these out there. And then what's happened is there's been a ton of people citing faulty citation strings. They start with one that's wrong, and then they cite other people who have cited that. It's all over the place. So you have big summary things like Crampon Perrins, Birds of the Western Palearctic, and it cites a bunch of stuff that's wrong, and then people cite it. So I'm sure everybody in the room has encountered this kind of stuff in their own fields where stuff gets in there and you can't get rid of it with a nuclear bomb. But that's what's happened here. So this basic source of the myth is basically some sensational statements about crossbills that are started because there are legitimate observations of both winter and summer breeding and people not understanding photoperiodism. And thinking because they breed on the shortest and longest days of the year, they can't have a basic photoperiodically dictated cycle. And that's just not true. And then it becomes wishful thinking because people love the idea that crossbills are so weird. You talk to ornithologists and they're just fascinated by them. They talk about, oh, they're the little feathered gypsies and this kind of stuff. And that's great. They really are cool, but we don't have to throw out the white-crowned sparrow rule book in order to understand how they work. So just to end up here, I just want to mention a couple things these are just notes to the graduate students because I was sort of going back through my old stuff as I was thinking about this. Our research is really only as good as the quality of the observations that we start with. Tinbergen's zeroth question, what is the animal doing? Start with that and then come up with your questions and your hypotheses. We need to be super vigilant for and careful not to perpetuate faulty citation strings. And we need to be cautious of statements that people make without actual data. That Formasov paper that Newton cited isn't even about reproduction. It's got one paragraph in it where no data are provided, where he just says, this is when they breed. And I think he's right in what he says. Newton cited it wrong, but it still had no data. The paper was about a seasonal occurrence of crossbills, and there's one little off-the-cuff thing in there. And there's a bunch of other examples of that where somebody just said something, and then it gets picked up by somebody else and perpetuated as dogma. We also, now I'm going to get a little woo-woo. We need to be wary of beautiful hypotheses. And I'm going to show you a quotation from one of my favorite books. It's The Log from the Sea of Cortez by John Steinbeck. And in that, he says, there is one great difficulty with a good hypothesis. When it is completed and rounded, the corners smooth and the content cohesive and coherent, it is likely to become a thing in itself, a work of art. It is then like a finished sonnet or a painting completed. One hates to disturb it. Even if subsequent information should shoot a hole in it, one hates to tear it down because it once was beautiful and whole. And I think this is, the idea of, crossbills being the pure opportunist that people thought they were. It actually is a beautiful hypothesis, but it's not actually a sensible one for if we had started with better observational foundations. And then once we start collecting data that we have people just say to us, well, you're wrong. We know what crossbills are like. And it's because they like this hypothesis, I think. They're not looking at the data. So the data that could shoot a hole in it or undermine it completely will be ignored if people are attracted enough to the hypothesis. And then we also need to be wary of bringing preconceived notions. So I think Ian Newton was guilty of this, unfortunately, when he looked at Formasov. So rather than looking at what Formasov said, he saw what he thought crossbills were doing, which was responding to food and breeding continuously in the fall. So here's another quotation from the same thing from the Log of the Sea of Cortez. Once we read a diary written by a man who came through Panama in 1839. He had read about the place before he got there, but the account he read was about the old city. And in his diary, written after he had gone through, he set down a description of the city he had read about. He didn't know that the town was not even in the same place, but he was not disturbed by these discrepancies. He knew what he would find there, and he found it. And I think we need to be super careful about not bringing our preconceived baggage to things and finding what we're looking for. It's instead of what's actually happening. It's especially a problem when we're designing experiments that we want to make sure, or just studies in general, it doesn't have to be experimental studies. We have to be sure we don't set it up in such a way that we're going to just confirm our bias. So I know everybody knows this stuff, but this is very important, and I think resonates with me whenever I think about the whole history of us trying to sort out what's happening with these fascinating birds. So when we go back to Griscom, those who finally believe that the riddle of migration has been largely explained by the effects of increased exposure to light and heat on the secretion of the sex hormones will find the crossbill a tough nut to crack. Actually, I would say no. We can actually crack the nut pretty well by thinking about white-crowned sparrows. And as I was getting ready to come here for this talk, I was thinking about how the white-crowned sparrows that we study at Tioga Pass, yeah, they're breeding when the days are long, but they're breeding on the worst weather that they encounter all year. They arrive in May and there can be sub-zero blizzard conditions, 50-mile-an-hour winds, and the mountain white-crowned sparrows are up there getting ready to breed. That's as impressive as what a crossbill does. A crossbill does it in January. Yeah, that's pretty amazing. But a mountain white-crowned sparrow is pretty darn hard nut to crack if you think it's just about light and heat. These animals do amazing things, and we hopefully can find out what they really are doing and not bring our preconceived notions to it. And so now I'm going to finish with just a picture I like of Jamie. And this is, I've really enjoyed doing all this field work and other experimental work with Jamie and other graduate students. I've been way luckier than I deserve to be about students that have chosen for some reason to come work with me. And we get to go to these beautiful places like the sewage lagoons near Signal Mountain in Grand Teton National Park, one of the most beautiful places in the world. Mount Moran in the background there through the pall of smoke that day. That was fire smoke. That's not some gunga coming off the sewage lagoons, thank goodness. But we've had a wonderful time doing a lot of field work, and there's still a lot to be learned about these birds. I think studying these weird and wonderful examples do have the potential to give us new insights into how all different kinds of birds and other animals do things. And I will shut up. I've gone over time. Thanks, and I'd be happy if there is time to answer questions. Yes.
I was kind of interested in your 12 varieties of crossbills.
Yeah.
One of the big questions in modern biology is what is a species and what are the processes of speciation? Do you think these are incipient new species?
So I think the question, if you couldn't hear it, was are all these different types of crossbills incipient new species, or what are they? And I think some people would say they actually just are species. They are largely probably reproductively isolated, but the data on that are pretty limited so far. There are genetic differences among these different types. I think that there is a good chance that they are at least incipient species. They operate in the wild. When you find them, they usually, even in a place where there's 2, 3, or 4 different types breeding together in the same location, typically the pairs that you find are true to type, but not 100% of them are. So there is some hybridization, or whatever you want to call it. I think the jury is still out on how this is going to settle out. There's one form that has been elevated to species status. It's called the Cassia crossbill. And it was formerly type 9. Craig Bankman discovered these in southern Idaho. And they turn out to be fairly sedentary, although even that is kind of turning out to maybe not be quite so true. They were thought to be isolated, sedentary and isolated to the South Hills and Albion Mountains in southern Idaho. And those have been decided to be currently a separate species. Personally, I think if they're a separate species, we should just split them all. And if we're not going to split them, we should just call them types for now until we sort out, more about reproductive isolation, ecological isolation. Craig Bankman's shown very well that all these different types have different performances on different cone types. But I still think there's just a lot more work to be done on this. How much of this is sympatric speciation, because they do overlap in range a lot of times, and how much of it is like a holdover from some period of isolation earlier, I don't know, during the Pleistocene or something. So your question is great. I don't have a clear, short answer to it. But I think we're going to see some interesting things continue, combining genetic approaches and, good field observational approaches, studies of potential hybridization or whatever you're going to call it, and so forth. Thanks.
How extreme the crossbills are, because I remember Alex Badia telling us that he had house finches nesting really early in the year in Missoula.
Yeah. Yes. Exactly. So the question there is, how extreme are crossbills even? And pointed out that house finches at least could be breeding really early. One of the chapters of my dissertation, now that you asked that question, I'm reminded by the fact that I was kind of interested in that even back then, and I was looking at a lot of different species for just how flexible their reproductive schedules are. And in some places, surprising species like band-tailed pigeons have an incredibly long breeding season, for example. And you mentioned house finches. There's lots of birds, and actually getting back to my point about like the rule book kind of being followed loosely, at least, by a lot of different species that do things in a lot of different ways. All photoperiodic birds actually start breeding when conditions are often, it's still pretty cold. Your example there of the house finches starting even earlier, that's one of those things. It could be that there's a lot of these finches in particular that are very flexible. And if house finches are getting a ton to eat at people's feeders or something, then maybe they can just start even earlier. House finch actually, though, interestingly, sorry, I do this all the time. I get like a train of thought and it takes me off in God knows what direction. House finch was, William Hamner was the one who demonstrated one of the most fundamental mechanisms of photoperiodism using house finches in his work he did at UCLA. It shows they actually use a circadian rhythm to determine day length. They're not measuring the total duration of light. They're measuring when it's light. They determine when it's light, and when light is falling during a certain part of their circadian day, they know, not cognitively, but they know, their physiology knows that it's a long day. So they're a long day breeder, but they can start really early and they can go a long time. There's examples of late breeding in house finches too. So I think that low temperatures don't necessarily inhibit things too much. Crossbills are kind of extreme. They've been shown, there's some records where people actually put thermocouples in nests, and it was, winter in Russia, and it's like 30 below. White-winged crossbills in Fairbanks are breeding when it's like 30 below zero. It's really freaking cold, and they breed quite successfully. I don't know, did Alex say how successful the house finches were when they started that early, or he's just saying they were doing it? Yeah, so well, it wouldn't surprise me, especially birds that are associated with humans. It wouldn't surprise me if it's almost every month of the year. But getting back to your basic question, how extreme are crossbills? I think they're at one point on a continuum, and they're not even the most extreme, because some of those desert finches actually probably are bona fide, able to nest in any month. Crossbills pretty much don't do that. So they may not even be, you know, following you up even further, they may not even be as extreme as some others in the same habitats. I've found pine siskins in breeding condition in October after I've ever seen a type 3 red crossbill would have already collapsed its gonads and be molting. And some pine siskins are still in full breeding condition then. So there may even be other finches that are more extreme than at least some of the crossbill types. Actually, this is one of the things Jamie's really interested now. She and her student Jalen have been looking at effects of temperature and humidity and rain and whatnot on crossbills, because it's possible that some of these ones that breed on the coast just don't breed as early. And is that because they can't, or is it just that they're physiologically constrained against it, like by their photoperiodic mechanisms, or is it that they are just experiencing such nasty conditions then that kind of facultatively they don't do it? But we have to wait and see, right? No, great question and long-winded answer. What else? Any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, very, very quick question, because I know people gotta run. The schedule that you showed where they start breeding in December
Yeah,
reminded me of the Wachowski and Howe tropical light experiments where they
with
found-
spotted antbirds.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They were sensitive to 6-minute change.
I think it was 11, but
Was it?
still, yeah. Yeah.
So could it be that the crossbills have the same abilities where they're just
Yeah.
after December 20th, days are getting longer?
Yeah.
things get
So,
rebuilt?
okay. So the question there is it possible that crossbills are just hypersensitive to tiny changes in photoperiod? Couple things to answer that. First, Berthold and Gwinner wrote a paper back in the 70s where they showed the birds were already back in full, and European ones could be already back in full breeding condition by the end of December, which would suggest they were starting before the photoperiod had started to increase. That's just, I make that observation. I'm not saying that it necessarily says what you were suggesting isn't right. I think it's very possible that they are sensitive to tiny changes in photoperiod, but here's again, I don't think that requires what we might think of as an adaptive specialization in crossbills, because it turns out all photoperiodic birds are absolutely incredibly sensitive to small changes in photoperiod. So there's experiments that have been done on house sparrows, for example, where birds at the summer solstice are either kept on the solstice photoperiod or exposed to tiny drops in the photoperiod that would happen after the solstice. And the house sparrows that experience the tiny drop, it's only a few minutes. It's on the same order as this response to the spotted antbirds that you mentioned that Howe and Wachowski had studied. And the birds on the declining photoperiod begin molt and collapse the gonads, so they express reproductive refractoriness earlier than the ones kept on constant long days after the solstice. So a tiny, tiny change is all it takes. So even on the background of a really long days, so this is true. That study was done in the UK, and the day length was like 18L and 18L 6D, and a few minutes drop was enough to distinguish these two experimental treatments. So they're really, really sensitive to small, even the birds that are responding to huge changes, huge seasonal cycles, are super responsive to small changes. We have a paper that is about this. I can send it to you. It's a long sucker of a thing, but it's about this issue of, all the differences. Do we have to attribute them, differences among species? Do we have to attribute them to adaptive specializations of all this cue response stuff? Or could it just be that the basic way that the birds do this stuff, the basic system is really nicely plastic in the way it processes a different bunch of cues so that you can actually produce a pretty nice adaptive schedule in a variety of conditions without changing a thing. So anyway, I can send you that and you can use it as soporific reading. Thank you for coming.